A missile crossed into a NATO country during one of the largest air raids of the war. That's the claim on the table in Warsaw right now, and it's why fighter jets went up over Polish skies within the hour. Polish government officials say a Russian missile entered Polish territory during a large-scale missile and drone barrage aimed at Kyiv. The Polish Armed Forces Operational Command says it scrambled aircraft and raised the readiness of ground-based air defense systems while the strike on the Ukrainian capital was still underway. Radar operators at regional command posts reportedly tracked an unidentified fast-moving object crossing from Ukrainian airspace westward, which triggered an immediate scramble order to F-16 squadrons on rotating alert. Poland's foreign ministry summoned Russia's chargé d'affaires to lodge a formal protest, a step Warsaw doesn't take lightly. Here's the thing, though. What we actually know right now is narrower than the headlines suggest, and that gap is worth sitting with for a moment. Polish officials say a missile crossed into their airspace and, in some accounts, struck Polish territory. Still under investigation. The missile's exact type, its origin, and whether it was a direct Russian launch, a stray weapon that lost its flight path, or something intercepted and deflected during Ukraine's own air defense response. Polish and NATO officials have been careful, publicly, to separate what's confirmed from what's still being examined. That's not a technicality. It's the difference between an accident and an attack, and it will shape how NATO responds. So here's the real question this video answers. How does a single missile, in a war that has run for years without officially crossing into NATO territory this way, turn into an alliance-wide problem within hours? To understand that, you need to understand what Poland's border with Ukraine has already been through, and why NATO built an entire response system for exactly this kind of moment. I went back through the public record on Poland's airspace incidents since the start of the full-scale invasion. One thing kept standing out. This isn't the first time, and each previous time changed how seriously the alliance treats its eastern flank. The clearest precedent is November 2022 in the village of Przywodow, near the Ukrainian border. A missile landed there and killed 2 people. Local men in their 60s, both employed at a grain drying facility, who had just finished loading a truck when the strike hit. Their families later described them as ordinary rural workers who had nothing to do with the war a few hours' drive away, and that detail mattered enormously to how the Polish public absorbed the news. Initial reports assumed a direct Russian strike on NATO soil. Poland invoked Article 4 of the NATO Treaty, which triggers formal consultations among member states when a country believes its territorial integrity, political independence, or security is threatened. Investigators spent days combing the impact site, photographing fragment patterns, and cross-referencing radar tracks from multiple Allied surveillance assets. They eventually concluded the missile was most likely a Ukrainian air defense interceptor that had gone astray while responding to a Russian barrage, not a Russian weapon fired directly at Poland. That distinction mattered enormously. It meant the incident was tragic, but not an attack by Russia on a NATO member, and it didn't trigger Article 5, the collective defense clause under which an armed attack on one member is treated as an attack on all. Here's where the story bends, though. Przywodow wasn't the last incident, and the pattern since then has trended in one direction, more frequent, not less. In September 2025, Russian drones entered Polish airspace in a single large incursion during a strike aimed at western Ukraine. Poland and Allied aircraft engaged and shot down several of the drones. The first time NATO forces had fired on Russian military assets over Allied territory during the war. Pilots involved described minutes of ambiguity on their instruments, trying to tell slow-moving decoys from armed drones before authorization to fire came through. Poland again invoked Article 4 consultations. NATO responded by launching Eastern Sentry, a reinforced air policing and air defense posture along the alliance's eastern edge, adding fighter squadrons, air defense assets, and surveillance aircraft from multiple member states. What used to be an isolated, deeply unusual event had, by late 2025, become something NATO planners were actively preparing to see again. That's the context this new claim lands in. If Polish officials are right that this time a missile, not a drone, reached Polish territory, that's an escalation in both the weapon involved and how directly it crossed the border. Drones are slow, cheap, and can plausibly drift off course over long distances. A missile crossing into NATO airspace during a strike on a capital more than 500 kilometers from the Polish border is a harder thing to explain away. I spent time going through how Poland's air defense picture has changed since 2022, and one detail is easy to miss in all the noise. Poland has spent years building exactly the system that responded within the hour here. Patriot air defense batteries, contributed by allies and purchased directly by Warsaw, sit alongside Polish-operated systems along the eastern border. NATO's enhanced air policing mission keeps fighter jets from multiple member states on rotating alert specifically to intercept unidentified aircraft or missiles near Allied airspace. None of that infrastructure existed at this scale before the war. It exists now because Przewodow and the 2025 drone incursion taught the alliance that the border with Ukraine wasn't a fixed line that dangerous weapons would respect. There's also a slower, less visible layer to this buildup worth mentioning. Years spent training controllers and pilots to make split-second calls under exactly this kind of ambiguity. After Przewodow, several Allied air forces revised their alert protocols specifically to shorten the gap between a radar contact appearing and a scramble order going out. That kind of institutional learning doesn't make headlines the way a shot-down drone does, but it's arguably what determined how fast jets got airborne this time. So the question worth holding on to isn't just what happened, but what has to be true for NATO's collective defense promise to actually mean something. Article 5 gets described as automatic, but it isn't. It requires member states to agree, together, that an armed attack occurred. That single word, attack, is doing enormous work. A missile that strayed off course during a defensive intercept isn't the same, legally or politically, as one deliberately aimed at Polish territory. Investigators will spend weeks, maybe longer, trying to establish which one this was, using radar tracking data, missile fragments if any are recovered, and flight path analysis. That fragment recovery process is worth slowing down on because it's far messier than it sounds from the outside. After Przewodow, forensic teams sealed off a roughly 200-meter radius around the impact site, photographed debris in place before moving anything, and shipped fragments to a military laboratory for metallurgical and serial number analysis. Even with all that, it took investigators several days to reach a preliminary conclusion, and longer still to reach consensus among Allied intelligence services. If a similar process is underway now at whatever site this missile allegedly struck, expect the same slow, deliberately unhurried timeline, and expect early claims about missile type to shift as that analysis proceeds. Here's the take that will probably draw some pushback. The ambiguity itself may be doing exactly what an adversary would want, whether or not that's the intent behind any single incident. A missile that might have crossed a border creates pressure and forces a response without crossing the clear red line that would unambiguously trigger Article 5. Whether or not this specific incident was deliberate, the pattern of near misses puts NATO in a position where it has to treat every one of them seriously. That's exhausting and expensive to sustain indefinitely. What would you have done, sitting in the Polish Operational Command Center, the moment radar showed an unidentified track crossing into your airspace during an active barrage on a foreign capital? There's no clean playbook for that decision in real time, just training, protocol, and minutes to act. Diplomatically, Poland's response so far has followed a familiar, deliberate escalation ladder. Summoning a charge d'affaires is a formal but measured step, a protest, not a rupture in relations. In practice, that meeting typically involves a Polish deputy foreign minister reading a formal note of protest aloud, the Russian representative offering a brief, often non-committal response, and both sides logging the exchange for the record. It looks understated on paper, but it signals exactly how seriously Warsaw is treating this. It says Warsaw wants an explanation and considers the incident serious, while stopping short of a response that would signal the alliance believes it was directly targeted. NATO's Secretary General's office and allied capitals typically wait for the country most directly affected, Poland, in this case, to characterize the incident officially before commenting on next steps like reinforcing the eastern flank or convening the North Atlantic Council. What strikes me about this case is less the missile itself and more what it reveals about the last several years. NATO's eastern border has effectively become a live testing ground for how quickly an alliance built for a different era of warfare can adapt its rules of engagement to fast-moving projectiles, ambiguous origins, and minutes-long decision windows. That's not a knock on any single country's response. It's just the reality Poland and the whole alliance now operates inside. Where this stands right now. Polish officials say a missile crossed into their territory during the barrage on Kyiv, fighter jets were scrambled, air defense readiness was raised, and a diplomatic protest was lodged with Russia's representative in Warsaw. Still unconfirmed, the missile's precise origin, whether it was a direct Russian launch or an intercepted or stray weapon, and what physical evidence, if any, has been recovered on Polish soil. Treat any specific casualty, damage, or missile-type claims you see elsewhere with caution until Polish or NATO officials confirm them on the record. Is a single stray or misdirected missile enough to justify treating an incident as an attack under NATO's collective defense framework? Or does that threshold demand something more deliberate and unambiguous? I genuinely don't know. It's worth thinking through rather than assuming the answer either way. If you want to verify any of this yourself instead of taking a script's word for it, start with the Polish Armed Forces Operational Command's own statements, NATO's official press releases following any Article 4 consultation, and reporting from established defense outlets that track these incidents closely. We'll drop the specific sources below. One more thing worth sitting with before you go. Incidents like Przewodow in 2022 and the drone incursion in 2025 were both, at first, reported with far more certainty than the facts actually supported. In both cases, the early narrative shifted once investigators finished their work. That's not a reason to dismiss today's reports. Polish officials are a credible primary source. But it is a reason to watch how this story develops over the coming days instead of treating the first version as the final one. We'll be tracking how Poland and NATO characterize this incident as the investigation continues, and whether it leads to further reinforcement of the eastern flank the way the 2025 drone incursion did. If this kind of airspace incident is becoming a recurring feature of this war rather than a rare exception, that pattern itself might be the bigger story. We'll keep following it.